The first frost of autumn had settled over the fields outside Ashwood, turning the grass silver beneath the rising sun. Every morning Thomas Walker followed the same quiet routine. At 40 years old, the widowed farmer had long since grown used to silence. His weathered boots crunched across the frozen ground as he carried 2 buckets toward the cattle pasture, accompanied only by the soft padding of Rusty, his aging golden retriever. Life on the farm rarely surprised him anymore. Until that morning, Rusty suddenly stopped walking. The old dog lifted his nose, ears twitching, then let out a low whine unlike anything Thomas had heard before. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked. Instead of following, Rusty trotted toward the old wooden fence bordering the county road. Thomas frowned and followed. At first he thought someone had abandoned a bundle of clothes. Then the bundle moved. Curled tightly against one of the fence posts sat a small boy, no older than 8. His thin jacket was several sizes too big, its sleeves hanging past his hands. Dust covered his worn boots, and his knees were pulled tightly against his chest, as though he hoped to disappear into himself. Rusty approached carefully. Instead of barking, the old dog simply sat beside him. The boy slowly looked up. His blue eyes were red from crying, but there were no fresh tears left. Thomas crouched several feet away. "Morning." No answer. "You lost?" The boy shook his head. "You waiting for someone?" Another slow shake. Thomas noticed the child's hands trembling from the cold. "What's your name?" After several long seconds, a tiny voice finally answered. "Eli." "I'm Thomas." Silence returned. Thomas glanced toward the empty road stretching across the hills. No wagon, no horse, no footprints except the boy's. No one was coming. "You been here all night?" Eli nodded. The answer settled heavily inside Thomas's chest. He reached into the lunch sack hanging from his belt. It held the sandwich he'd packed for himself before sunrise. Without saying anything, he held it out. Eli stared at it as though he wasn't sure it was meant for him. "It's yours." The boy accepted it carefully with both hands. For several seconds he didn't eat. Instead, he slowly pulled the sandwich apart. Thomas watched him place one half back into the paper wrapper before taking a small bite from the other. "You don't like it?" Thomas asked gently. Eli swallowed before answering. "I'll save half. For later. For tomorrow morning." Thomas felt something tighten inside him. No child should think that way. "You don't know if you'll have breakfast?" Eli looked down. "I never know." The words were quiet, matter of fact, as if hunger was simply another part of life. Thomas looked across the empty pasture. Years ago, another child had been meant to run through these fields. He remembered the tiny pair of knitted booties Sarah had made before their baby was lost. They had remained tucked inside an old cedar chest ever since, untouched by time. He had buried more dreams than crops. Now, standing before him, was a boy trying to make half a sandwich last until tomorrow. Thomas stood. "You hungry enough for eggs?" Eli blinked. "What?" "I asked if you'd like breakfast. You already gave me this." "I know. But nothing." Thomas smiled for the first time that morning. "A sandwich isn't breakfast." Eli looked almost confused. "Why?" "Because everybody deserves breakfast." The boy stared at him as though he had never heard those words before. Thomas held out his hand. "My farm's just over that hill." Eli hesitated. Thomas didn't rush him. He understood what fear looked like. Eventually, Eli stood on shaky legs. He didn't take Thomas's hand, but he walked beside him. For now, that was enough. The wagon creaked gently as they made their way back toward the farmhouse. Rusty rested near Eli's boots, occasionally nudging the boy's hand with his nose. After several minutes, Eli cautiously scratched behind the old dog's ears. Rusty's tail immediately began wagging. Thomas chuckled. "Looks like you've got yourself a friend." "I've never had a dog." "Neither has Rusty." Eli looked confused. Thomas grinned. "He's always thought he owned me." For the first time since they'd met, Eli smiled. It was tiny, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, But Thomas saw it. And somehow, that small smile warmed the cold morning more than the rising sun. As the farmhouse came into view, Eli's smile disappeared. It's big. Thomas looked at the old white house. Peeling paint, crooked porch, a roof that needed repairing. It used to feel smaller. When someone else lived there. Eli didn't ask who. Some questions didn't need answers. The front door creaked open. Inside, the house smelled of fresh bread and coffee. The walls were plain. The furniture was old. But everything was clean. Everything had its place. Everything. Except laughter. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd heard any inside these walls. Rusty walked straight toward the fireplace, before lying down with a satisfied sigh. Thomas hung his coat on the hook beside the door. Come on. Eli remained standing near the entrance. You can come in. I'm making the floor dirty. Thomas looked down. The boy's boots were covered with mud. So are mine. Eli stayed frozen. I can clean it. Thomas picked up an old towel and tossed it toward him. Then we'll clean it together. For a moment, Eli simply stared at the towel. Not because it was special, but because no one had ever said we. Not to him. Not in a very long time. Thomas headed toward the kitchen. I've got fresh eggs, homemade bread, and enough bacon to make Rusty jealous. Rusty barked once from the fireplace. Thomas laughed. See? He's already negotiating. Behind him, very quietly, he heard something he hadn't heard inside his farmhouse for years. A child's soft laugh. And without realizing it, Thomas Walker smiled all the way to the kitchen. The kitchen quickly filled with the comforting smell of bacon sizzling in the cast-iron pan. Thomas cracked fresh eggs into another skillet while Eli remained quietly near the doorway, unsure if he should step any farther inside. You don't have to stand there, Thomas said without looking up. There's a chair with your name on it. Eli hesitated. I don't know which one. Thomas smiled. Any chair becomes yours if you sit in it. Slowly, Eli climbed onto the wooden chair across the table. His eyes followed every movement Thomas made, as though he were watching something completely unfamiliar. Within minutes, a plate piled with eggs, bacon, warm bread, and homemade jam rested in front of him. Eli stared at it. Aren't you eating? Thomas asked. The boy looked toward Rusty, who sat patiently beside the table with hopeful eyes. Does he eat first? Thomas laughed softly. No, he just likes pretending he should. Rusty wagged his tail as if agreeing. Only then did Eli pick up his fork. He took one cautious bite. Then another. Soon he was eating faster than Thomas had ever seen anyone eat. Halfway through the meal, Eli suddenly stopped. He carefully wrapped the remaining slice of bread in a napkin. Thomas noticed. You saving it? Eli nodded. For later. Thomas sat down across from him. Eli. The boy looked up nervously. You never have to earn breakfast in this house. The words hung quietly between them. And you never have to save today's food because you're afraid of tomorrow. Eli lowered his eyes. What if I don't stay tomorrow? Thomas couldn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't know. He hadn't spoken to the sheriff. He hadn't asked any questions. All he knew was that a frightened little boy had spent the night alone beside a road. So he answered the only way he could. Then you'll still leave here with a full stomach. For the first time that morning, Eli didn't seem frightened. He simply nodded and finished every bite on his plate. After breakfast, Thomas handed Eli a pair of old work gloves. They're too big. So were mine when I was your age. Eli slipped them on anyway. The fingers flopped awkwardly past his own, making Thomas chuckle. Perfect. The morning passed with simple chores. Thomas fed the chickens while Eli scattered grain. Rusty supervised both jobs as though he were the farm manager. When one stubborn hen escaped the pen, Eli chased after it across the yard, laughing as it zigzagged between barrels. Eventually, Rusty cornered the runaway bird without harming it. "I think he deserves a promotion," Thomas joked. "What kind?" "Chief Chicken Inspector." Eli laughed again. The sound echoed across the quiet farm. Thomas hadn't realized how empty the place had become until laughter returned to it. By afternoon, the frost had melted, leaving the fields bright beneath the autumn sun. Thomas led Eli toward the old oak tree, standing at the edge of the pasture. A weathered wooden swing still hung from one of its thick branches. "It still works?" Eli asked. "We're about to find out." Thomas tested the ropes. "Strong enough." He stepped aside. "Go ahead." Eli climbed onto the swing carefully. At first he barely moved. Thomas gave one gentle push. The swing drifted forward. Then back. Another push. A little higher. Soon Eli's laughter floated across the fields as the autumn wind rushed through his hair. Thomas leaned against the tree, smiling. Years earlier, he and Sarah had hung that swing for the child they had expected. After losing the baby, neither of them had found the strength to take it down. Since Sarah's passing, it had remained untouched. Until today, for the first time in years, it was doing exactly what it had been built to do. As the sun began to sink lower, they walked back toward the farmhouse. Near the porch, Eli noticed a faded handprint pressed into an old stepping stone. "Whose is that?" Thomas looked down. For a long moment he didn't answer. "It was supposed to belong to my child." Eli remained silent. "I made it before the baby was born." Thomas smiled sadly. "But life doesn't always follow the plans we make." He expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Eli quietly reached out and placed his small hand beside the faded print. "It doesn't have to stay lonely anymore." Thomas looked at the two handprints. One frozen in the past, one alive in the present. Something shifted inside him. Not grief. Not happiness. Hope. That evening, while Thomas repaired a broken lantern on the porch, the sound of wagon wheels echoed up the dirt road. Rusty stood immediately. A wagon stopped outside the gate. Sheriff Caleb Morris climbed down, removing his hat. "Evening, Thomas." Thomas nodded. "What brings you out?" The sheriff glanced toward Eli, who was quietly brushing Rusty's fur on the porch. "I've been looking for him." Eli froze. The brush slipped from his hands. Thomas noticed the fear returning to the boy's face. "Easy," Thomas said gently. The sheriff stepped closer. "No one's here to hurt you, son." After a long silence, Eli whispered, Are you taking me away?" Sheriff Morris sighed. "We've been trying to find where you belong." "I don't have anywhere." The words landed heavily. The sheriff looked toward Thomas. "We haven't found any family yet." Thomas folded his arms. "So what happens now?" "If no relatives come forward," the sheriff began carefully, "the county will place him in the children's home until a guardian is approved." Eli lowered his head. Thomas could almost see the hope draining from the boy's face. He looked toward the farmhouse. Toward the swing. Toward Rusty lying beside Eli's feet. Then back at the sheriff. "What if he stayed here?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "You mean temporarily?" Thomas nodded. "Until everything's sorted out." Sheriff Morris studied him for a long moment before speaking. "It isn't that simple." "When is it ever?" A faint smile crossed the sheriff's face. "I'll speak with Judge Harper." He looked at Eli. "It'll take a hearing before anything becomes official." Eli didn't fully understand what that meant. But he understood one thing. Thomas wasn't sending him away tonight. As darkness settled over the farm, the kitchen lights glowed warmly through the windows. For the first time in what felt like forever, 3 souls shared the same home. A lonely farmer, a forgotten boy, and an old golden retriever who somehow knew, long before either of them did, that this family had already begun. The next few days passed more quickly than either Thomas or Eli expected. Each morning began the same way. Rusty scratched gently at Eli's bedroom door before sunrise. By the time Eli opened it, the old dog would already be wagging his tail, eager to begin another day. Soon, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs and helping Thomas around the barn no longer felt like chores. They felt like life. One afternoon, Thomas found Eli sitting on the fence overlooking the pasture. "You look deep in thought," Eli shrugged. "I was trying to remember." "Remember what?" "My mum's face." Thomas remained quiet. "Some days I can." He looked down. "Some days I can't." Thomas climbed onto the fence beside him. "My wife used to tell me something." Eli listened. "She said people don't disappear when you forget little things about them." "What happens?" "They stay in the parts of you they helped build." Eli thought about that for a long moment. "I hope that's true." "I know it is." A week later, a letter arrived from the county courthouse. Thomas read it silently before folding it back into the envelope. Eli noticed immediately. "Is something wrong?" Thomas forced a small smile. "We have to visit Judge Harper tomorrow." Eli's smile faded. Am I leaving?" "No." Thomas knelt beside him. "It's a hearing." "What's that?" "It's where the judge decides what's best for you." Eli looked frightened again. "What if he thinks somewhere else is better?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rested a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Then I'll tell him exactly what I've seen." "What have you seen?" Thomas smiled. "A boy who helps without being asked. A boy who laughs with an old dog. A boy who finally sleeps through the night. And a boy who deserves to belong somewhere." That evening, Thomas sat alone on the porch after Eli had gone to bed. Rusty lay beside him, watching the stars appear. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas whispered. Rusty responded by placing his gray muzzle on Thomas's knee. Thomas laughed softly. "You're not much for advice, are you?" The dog simply stayed there. Sometimes that was enough. Thomas realized something he had been afraid to admit. When he imagined the farmhouse without Eli, it felt empty again. The courthouse stood in the center of Ashwood, its brick walls older than anyone living in town. Eli held tightly to Thomas's hand as they walked inside. The waiting room felt enormous. Families spoke quietly among themselves. Children played with wooden toys in the corner. Eli stayed close. Judge Benjamin Harper entered the courtroom a few minutes later. He was known throughout the county as a fair man who listened before making decisions. After everyone was seated, the judge looked toward Thomas. "Mr. Walker, you've requested temporary guardianship while the county continues searching for relatives." "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" Thomas looked at Eli, then back at the judge. "Because every child deserves to wake up knowing someone is glad they're there." Silence filled the room. The judge nodded. Sheriff Morris stepped forward. "We've searched neighboring counties. No immediate relatives have been located." Judge Harper made a few notes. Then he looked toward Eli. "Would you like to tell me how you've been doing on Mr. Walker's farm?" Eli's feet barely reached the floor from the wooden chair. He swallowed hard. "He's nice." A few quiet smiles appeared around the room. The judge smiled gently. "Can you tell me more?" Eli looked toward Thomas before answering. "He doesn't yell. He eats breakfast with me. He says thank you when I help." The room remained completely silent. "And?" Eli hesitated. "He told me I don't have to earn breakfast." Thomas lowered his eyes. Even now, hearing those words spoken aloud broke his heart. Judge Harper removed his glasses for a moment. "Has anyone ever told you that before?" Eli slowly shook his head. "No, sir." Before the judge could continue, someone stood from the back of the courtroom. "Mrs. Henderson." The elderly baker from town. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, Your Honor." Judge Harper nodded. "Go ahead." She smiled toward Eli. "That little fellow has been helping carry flour bags every Saturday. He refuses payment." Instead, she held up a small drawing. "He asked if I had extra paper because he wanted to draw Rusty." Soft laughter filled the courtroom. Then another voice spoke. "Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith. The boy sweeps my shop every Thursday." I've never once asked him to." Soon another neighbor stood. Then another. Each one shared a small story. How Eli always thanked people. How he smiled more each week. How Thomas smiled more too. The judge listened to every word. Finally, he folded his hands together. "I've heard enough." The room became perfectly still. He looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Walker, you've given this child more than a roof. You've given him peace." Then he turned toward Eli. "And you've reminded this town what kindness looks like." Judge Harper signed several papers. Effective immediately. "I am granting Thomas Walker temporary legal guardianship of Eli until the adoption review can be completed." Eli didn't fully understand the legal words, so he whispered the only question that mattered. "I'm going home with Mr. Thomas?" Judge Harper smiled warmly. "Yes, son. You are." Outside the courthouse, Eli threw his arms around Thomas without warning. Thomas froze, then wrapped both arms around the boy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rusty barked happily from beside the wagon, his tail thumping against the wooden wheel. Sheriff Morris walked over, smiling. "Looks like you've got a busy year ahead of you." Thomas nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the wagon rolled away from town, Eli looked back once at the courthouse, then ahead toward the farm. For the first time in years, he wasn't wondering where he would sleep that night. He already knew. Life settled into a gentle rhythm after the court hearing. Winter arrived quietly, covering the fields in fresh snow. Every morning, Thomas and Eli worked side by side before sharing breakfast at the kitchen table. Rusty, as always, waited patiently nearby, hoping someone would accidentally drop a piece of bacon. The farmhouse no longer felt silent. It sounded alive. Laughter echoed through the halls. Boots hurried across the wooden floors. The fireplace stayed warm long after sunset, and every evening ended with Thomas reading from an old storybook, while Rusty slept at their feet. One evening, as snow drifted past the window, Eli looked up from his book. "Mr. Thomas." "Yes, how long do I get to stay?" Thomas closed his book slowly. "As long as you need." "But what if someone comes looking for me?" Thomas reached across the table. "If that day ever comes, we'll face it together." Eli nodded. For the first time, he believed those words. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see these stories bring people together from all around the world. Let me know your country and city in the comments. Now, let's see what happened next. Spring slowly replaced the snow. The fields turned green once more. Eli started attending the little school in Ashwood, walking there each morning with a lunch Thomas packed before sunrise. At first, the other children barely spoke to him, but Eli had learned something during his time on the farm. Kindness didn't have to be loud. When another boy dropped his books, Eli helped gather them. When a younger girl cried because she couldn't solve an arithmetic lesson, he stayed after class to help. Little by little, classmates began saving him a seat. Teachers noticed the quiet confidence growing inside him. Each afternoon he hurried home, eager to tell Thomas about everything he had learned. Thomas found himself looking toward the road every day around 3 o'clock. Not because he worried, because he couldn't wait to hear the front door open. The seasons continued to change. Summer brought longer evenings, fresh vegetables from the garden, and fishing trips to the nearby creek. Autumn arrived with another harvest. This time, Thomas wasn't working alone. Standing beside him was a smiling boy, who had become as much a part of the farm as the old oak tree. One afternoon, they finished stacking hay just before sunset. Thomas wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I couldn't have done this without you," Eli grinned proudly. "I know," Thomas laughed. "Well, at least you're honest," Rusty barked once, almost demanding credit for supervising. "I suppose you helped too," Thomas said. The old dog wagged his tail as though accepting the compliment. Almost a year after Eli had first been found beside the fence, another letter arrived from the courthouse. Thomas read it twice, then a third time. His hands trembled. Eli noticed immediately. Is it bad? Thomas looked at him with watery eyes. No. A smile slowly spread across his face. I think it's the best letter I've ever received. A week later they stood once again inside Judge Harper's courtroom. This time the room felt different. It wasn't filled with uncertainty. It felt like a celebration. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row. Mr. Jenkins tipped his hat as they entered. Sheriff Morris smiled from the back of the room. Judge Harper looked over the file one final time. Over the past year, he began, this court has received nothing but positive reports. He smiled toward Eli. Excellent attendance at school, outstanding behavior, and one very happy golden retriever. Soft laughter filled the courtroom. Judge Harper turned toward Thomas. Mr. Walker, you welcomed a frightened child into your home when you had no obligation to do so. You gave him safety. You gave him patience. And most importantly, you gave him a family. The judge picked up his pen. I am honored to approve the adoption of Eli Walker. The room erupted in applause. Eli looked around, confused for only a moment. Then he realized what the judge had said. Walker. He now shared Thomas's last name. Judge Harper handed over the signed papers. They're official. Thomas accepted them carefully. For a moment he couldn't speak. Years earlier he had believed the dream of becoming a father had ended forever. Yet somehow, life had written a different ending. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun shone warmly over Ashwood. The townspeople congratulated them before slowly returning to their own lives. Thomas and Eli climbed into the wagon. Neither of them spoke during the ride home. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. As the farmhouse appeared in the distance, Eli looked toward Thomas. His voice was almost a whisper. Can we go home, Dad? Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment. It was the word he had dreamed of hearing for years. When he finally looked back at the boy beside him, tears blurred the road ahead. He smiled anyway. Yeah, son. Let's go home. Rusty was waiting on the porch, barking excitedly as the wagon rolled into the yard. Eli jumped down first and wrapped his arms around the old dog. Thomas followed more slowly, looking at the farmhouse that had once felt far too quiet. Now it echoed with footsteps, laughter, hope. Inside, Eli noticed the faded baby handprint beside the doorway. Without saying a word, he placed his own hand beside it once again. This time Thomas stood beside him. 3 lives, 3 stories, 1 family. That evening they shared a simple dinner around the old wooden table. Nothing expensive, nothing extraordinary. Just fresh bread, warm soup, and people who wanted to be together. As the sun disappeared beyond the fields, Thomas realized something. The greatest harvest of his life had never grown from the soil. It had begun on the morning an old dog stopped beside a lonely fence, and a frightened little boy accepted half of a sandwich. Sometimes the families we treasure most are not the ones we are born into. They are the ones we choose, one act of kindness at a time.